In this video, I will be speaking with Professor Janet Smith, our expert of inequalities and segregation in Chicago. Welcome, Janet.
Thank you.
Chicago, at least some time ago, was called a city of opportunity, with opportunities for good jobs, good education, housing. And what do research results tell us about Chicago today?
Well, what we found in terms of the city and what's changed over the last 25, 30 years is that inequality is growing in the Chicago region and at a faster rate than the US, especially in the last 10 to 15 years. Cities like Chicago that were, industrial base, as they lost that base, started to change their identity and really shift to become more what we call, the global city and the global economy. And for Chicago, that was actually really an easy transition, although it happened much later in the 1990s, because we actually had a pretty strong manufacturing base. And that stayed because we had such diversity in the manufacturing. So unlike cities that had, car manufacturing or really concentration of one industry, we were very diverse. So we've continued to have a stronger manufacturing base even now compared to other cities. But as that shrunk and we became more of a global city, what we saw was we were playing to our strength of being a transportation hub, but also being a center of finance and business. Even though we're not in New York and in LA or San Francisco for those purposes, in the Midwest, Chicago is really that center of the United States. The money's coming in from businesses, but also from higher income people. And if you think about it, cities that have higher income people need fewer services, or at least social services and publicly provided services, because they can afford to pay for those services. So what you start to see is gentrification becomes an economic development strategy. And so I'm not saying that change shouldn't happen, but what we start to see is that the kind of changes that are happening are not necessarily benefiting the longstanding residents, the lower income residents, the working class residents of the city. And it's really starting to create the divides that now we're living with. And so housing affordability is a key problem, of course, but it's also where jobs are located. It has impact on transportation, in terms of who uses transportation, who relies on it and needs it.
And one of the conclusions were that the city becomes both richer and poorer. And how does it happen?
Income is increasing in the areas that have always had high income and expanding, while lower income areas have expanded in space, but are shrinking in number of people. And then there are a few places now. I mean, Chicago in the 1970s was what we would call a middle income city. And you could look at that spatially and see a distribution. It wasn't all middle income, but the large part of the city was a mix of people of high and low, but mostly middle income people. By the time you get to 2000 and 2010 in particular, we don't see the middle there anymore, really. We see still some neighborhoods that would be called middle income. But what we find is that, as I've said earlier, middle income have been moving out to the suburbs. That's true. But even then, we don't see a lot of middle income suburbs anymore. We see mixed income neighborhoods, but not so much in the middle. And I would argue that occupation shifts have probably driven that to a certain extent. Sure, people have moved because they talk about affordability and they leave the city. But at the same time, so the lower income people are leaving the city, but at the same time, higher income people are moving in, leaving places like New York and San Francisco, which are much more expensive. They come to Chicago. So what we see is the income groups shifting, and we also see the occupation shifting. When we looked at occupations and just sort of who are at the top and who are at the bottom, and then the middle, what we see is in the middle, which is like people who work in education or manufacturing, in police services and skilled labor, have left the city. And are leaving the region even. And so what you see is the increase in those kind of higher end jobs in particular, replacing those middle income jobs. And so therefore you don't have those people either working in those jobs, or the middle income may be working in lower wage jobs. And that was something we were concerned about after the recession in 2008 and 2009, is that a lot of people didn't necessarily go back into the financial services jobs they had, for example, that were impacted by the recession, and ended up instead working in service sector jobs in the lower wage occupations. The biggest result, and this research shows in this chapter, is that inequality has grown. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, how are we using strategies like equity planning to actually change that? And the real discussions we're having now, and this is post-pandemic, as it became apparent that a lot of the people who were affected and infected by the coronavirus are people of color living in lower income neighborhoods. Part of that is their access to health services. So we know that was a problem. So you see higher rates of infection and disease and death. But the also that became really apparent was these are also the same communities where essential workers live. And so you have people who are living in Latino and African American communities who are risking their lives daily to commute to work, to provide services, while the majority of higher income workers who are white and living in different parts of the city and the region are working at home. And so this has raised a lot of questions. And, we can look at our summer of unrest where we see a lot of, social movements starting around, particularly Black Lives Matter, has really changed the conversation about not just income inequality, but racial and ethnic inequality.
So if you could list 3 main drivers of segregation, what would be these 3 drivers?
So if you think about this intersection of race, ethnicity, and income and occupations, and then add to it spatial segregation, it starts to lay out sort of what we would see as many key drivers of not just new income and occupation segregation, but sustained forms of that over the last, I would say, 50 years. With any new development, depending on the situation, there's a requirement that some of the housing be affordable. So if you're building expensive building, you have to have at least 10% of those units be affordable to lower income people. So what the idea is that over time, that mix would, happen. It's still small and it's still a long time coming, but it's changing sort of the space of the city. And people are talking more about increasing that percentage so that we start to see more like 20 to 30% of the housing be affordable to lower income people, because we've maybe overbuilt on the higher income side. And there's, so there's part of that practical problem of it, but it's also the advocacy and the work of people to say, why aren't we more mixed? Why don't we try and promote it? And the real estate and development history has really prevented that, but we can use, policy and planning to change that. The important thing is that if people can just live peacefully together, right? That would be success, I would think. For those people who don't want to live mixed or want to stay in the neighborhood that they live in because they like it, but they need some resources there, we should look at how we invest in those as well. And I think that's where there's a lot more conversation now than there has been in the past. Inequality will continue to grow. And what it will look like in terms of the distribution of workers will probably not change much. But I think there are going to be efforts to at least try and change some of the racial segregation or the results of racial segregation and income inequality, because people are talking about it very seriously. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
So is Chicago a city of opportunity? Was it before?
I think it was before, and I think it always will be. It's just the question of how much help different people get in that opportunity.